Hello.
Hello.
So, usual thing, I'll let people in and I'll come up with the questions.
Sure. And what screen do you see?
I see the intro to neuromeditation, the right screen, not the one that you probably see. Doesn't have
Okay.
all the extra stuff.
Okay. Perfect.
Right.
Morning, everybody joining us. We'll just wait another minute or so and then I'll get started.
Jeff, am I able to let people in? I'm not finding it.
Okay, let me it says you're the host.
Okay.
Did you open the participants?
You think I'd know how to do this by now? Just
There should be a little participant button at the bottom.
there it is. Thank you.
See if can you let the next person in and just make sure that that's working okay?
Uh, I don't see anybody.
There's somebody in the waiting room.
Yeah, and I don't see it. So I'm looking at the wrong thing then.
Did you find it?
No.
Everybody, give me 1 second. We're just dealing with a quick technical issue, and then we'll get started. So if you open participants,
Yeah,
and so you're not seeing,
not seeing
nothing shows up in the waiting room.
it. Yeah.
Hmm. All right. All right. And what if I do this? How about now? Hang on. How about now?
Bada bing, we got it.
Okay. All right. All right. Good morning, everybody. Nice to see at least some of you. And we'll have a few more people joining us, which is great. They can catch up in just a second. Um, so, we've got an hour, which is not a whole lot of time to try to cover the basics here. So I'm going to jump right in just a second. But because we have such a limited amount of time, if you have questions or if you want to chat with each other or share resources, you can just use the chat function in Zoom, which everybody's probably very comfortable with by now. And, drop any questions in there or anything else. And my office manager, Kathleen, is with us, and she'll be kind of monitoring that and trying to facilitate. Okay, so I'm going to jump in. So let's get started. My name's Jeff Tarrant. I'm the director of the NeuroMeditation Institute. I'm a licensed psychologist, board certified in neurofeedback. And there's a lot more I could say about my background, but again, just for time's sake, I'm just going to jump into the material. That's what everybody's interested in anyway. You can find out who I am if you want to, look at the websites. So first off, seems like it would make sense to define. Oh, look at that. It's a good way to start. My slide is funky, so the N on neuromeditation got moved. Seemed like a good place to start would be to define what we're talking about when we're using the term neuromeditation. So really what we're talking about is a brain-based approach to meditation. So simply using what we know about the brain in relation to meditation is a way to help us understand, categorize, think about ways to use meditation in specific ways for specific applications. Because as you'll see in a few minutes, the reality is that not all meditations are the same. Different meditations do different things in the brain. And because of that, there are different implications for how we might be able to use that. So the idea really is, how are we directing our attention? What are we doing with our attention? What is the intention during the meditation? Because that can change. And then in relation to those two things, what regions of the brain become activated or quieted during different practices? So when we kind of take that approach, we can start to organize the way that we think about meditation, and we can put them into different little categories. And so sometimes we talk about 4 styles of neuromeditation. Sometimes we talk about 5. Today, I'm just going to talk about 4 because the 5th one adds a whole nother complicated layer. But basically what we did was went into the research literature. There's a lot of information out there examining what's happening in the brain during meditation. So the good news for us is we didn't have to recreate the wheel. We could go out and look at all the data that's already been accumulated and say, well, how can we use this to help us understand what's going on here? And in general, we can organize styles of meditation into 4 different categories. Now, of course, there's going to be more than this, but these are the biggies. And so the first one we could call focus. So sometimes this is called a concentration practice, or you'll see it called focused attention. It's basically any kind of a meditation where you're directing your attention to a single target. So it might be the breath, it might be a mantra, it may be an image of the Buddha, whatever. But what they all have in common is that you're holding your attention on one thing, and then when the mind gets distracted, you bring it back. So because they all sort of share that commonality, there's some pretty similar things that happen in the brain across those various targets and how you're using them. So that's one category. Next category we call mindfulness. And that's a little bit of a tricky word to use, we're aware, because mindfulness, that term is being used to mean just about everything right now. It can mean, kind of in general out there, it could mean anything from relaxation to a body scan, to a walking meditation, there's all kinds of things that are considered mindfulness. For us, what's really important is how are you using your attention and intention? And so the way we're looking at it is a mindfulness practice is anything where you're really cultivating this non-judgmental awareness of the present moment. So you're not grasping and holding on to things that you like. You're not pushing away things you don't like. You're simply accepting things as they are. And so that's a little bit of a different approach than focus. Now, of course, they can go together, and they often do, but it's not quite the same thing. It's a little bit of a different way of paying attention. Because of that, the brain does something a little different. The third category we call open heart. And so again, this is kind of an umbrella term that's going to include things like loving kindness and compassion, but it also includes meditation practices that get into things like forgiveness or, you know, engaging with a feeling of joy or gratitude. So really any kind of practice where you're intentionally activating a positive emotional state. That's kind of that's the intention of the meditations. Now, we may do something with that feeling once we cultivate it. But again, they all kind of have that in common, cultivating a positive emotional state. Now, you might end up with a positive emotional state when you're doing mindfulness or focus, but that's not necessarily the intention. It's kind of a happy byproduct. So again, a little bit different. And then the fourth category is quiet mind. So the stereotype of meditation, right? That somehow you're going to sit down and empty your mind. There's nothing there. I like to call this quieter mind, just because I think it's a little more user-friendly, right? That maybe the idea isn't that there's nothing in your mind, but can we reduce the noise, from an 8 to a 5? That would be, I think, a success. So when we get into this state, it's different from the others because really there's nothing. If you're doing it in sort of an ideal way, there's nothing going on. You're not directing your attention toward anything. It's just empty and spacious and quiet. So these are kind of the four biggies. And what we're going to do for the rest of the time today is I'm going to give just a quick orientation to each of these in a little more detail. What's going on in the brain, what they seem to be good for, some of the tools that we use to move ourselves into these states. So the first thing is, okay, great. We've got these four categories. So which one should I use? And it's like, well, the way we look at it is like, well, it depends. What's your goal? What's your motivation? Why do you want to meditate? And again, that's a very Western way of thinking about meditation, right? If you study any traditional practices, it's kind of like, the idea is like, don't have a goal, just meditate, right? Let it take care of itself, which I completely respect. But we do live in the Western world. And the reality is that because I'm a psychologist, 95% of my clients, they're not going to do that, right? It's like, but if there is some way that we can orient them toward, hey, this particular type of meditation may help with whatever it is you're working on. And here's why, right? So then all of a sudden it becomes more interesting, more engaging. I found it funny, years ago when we first started doing this, I would have these classes and I kept getting a bunch of engineers in the class. And I thought that was funny. I was like, this seems odd. Like, why am I getting a bunch of engineers? And then it made sense to me. It's like, oh, it's because we're explaining how this works, right? It's like, so it's kind of like you give the left brain what it needs so that it can relax. And then people seem to be able to engage. It's like, oh, okay, I get it. All right, let's do it. So, I don't want to spend too much time on this slide because we could spend, 30 minutes just here. But this is just an orientation. So why would you use a focus practice? Well, if you think about what the focus practice is doing, what we're learning, what we're developing the ability to sustain attention, to reduce distractibility, to stay focused, right? To have a stability of attention. And I think this is why it's often the first thing that we learn when we're practicing meditation in just about any tradition. If you don't have a stability of attention, you're not going to be able to do anything, right? Like you got to sort of get this first. It's the basics. But we also, because of the way it affects the brain, it appears to be pretty good for things where there's frontal lobe concerns. Because if you think about it, if you're sustaining attention, you have to engage your frontal lobes. You're exercising your frontal lobes. And so things like ADHD or cognitive decline, or even things like, mild traumatic brain injuries. This could be a really useful strategy. I've got active depression in here because we'll get into this a little bit later if we have time. But one of the things that we've seen is that if somebody is, actively depressed, that certain things like open heart, which might seem like the perfect practice for them is really difficult. It's almost impossible. So we need to start with something else that's a little more stabilizing, helping them learn how to orient their attention towards something neutral. Then over time, we can shift it towards something like open heart. Mindfulness, this won't be a big shock to anybody, seems to be particularly good for dealing with stress and anxiety. Most of you are probably familiar with programs like mindfulness-based stress reduction. Literally, it's in the name. So they're using mindfulness practices to reduce stress. And this makes sense because with mindfulness, really what you're learning to do is to kind of step back into this observer role and not get attached to what is happening in the moment. And so think about the implications for anxiety or stress, right? When we're stressed and anxious, we're kind of stuck in the moment. We just keep repeating the same thoughts and the same feelings over and over again. But if you can step out of it and have a little bit more of an objective view, it's like a remedy. Open heart, obviously, going to be good for improving mood, increasing empathy, increasing gratitude, helping with perspective taking. So, this is useful for depression, but like I mentioned, sometimes we have to be a little careful at the beginning with that because it's a little too much. Somebody who's really in a depressed state, you ask them, oh, just feel gratitude. And it's like, yeah, that may feel like an impossibility, right? So we have to kind of start somewhere else. It can be good for unresolved grief, resentment, right? I'm sure nobody experiences resentment, but in pretend land, if you did, this would be a nice way to start to work with that. Now, quiet mind's an interesting one because theoretically it could be good for just about everything, right? If you could learn to quiet down all the internal noise, that's probably going to be good for depression and for anxiety and for just about everything else. But this is one of the most challenging practices for most people. In fact, it's one of the things we hear all the time from people is like, I can't meditate. And the reason they say that is because they've got the idea that they have to quiet their mind entirely, and they can't do that. And so they give up. So again, that's why we like to talk about quieter mind. But at the same time, quiet mind might be particularly good for situations where people have a distorted sense of themselves. Because again, what you're doing when you're quieting your mind is you're quieting that internal narrative about who you are and how you relate to things. If you can relax that, what it does is it provides space for something else to happen. You can start to change that narrative of how you see yourself. But first, you got to quiet down all the noise, the constant self-talk. It's also really good for chronic pain. That's a kind of a different issue. But because it really involves getting into a very relaxed state. If you want to relax your mind, you got to relax your body. And so that just seems to work really well with chronic pain clients. So what we did was we designed a inventory that people can take online. It's free. They don't have to even give us their email if they don't want to. But it's just a way for people to take a short quiz and help identify what might be a good starting place. So they answer some questions and it gives them a score for each of the styles. Now, again, not to get too complicated, but we added some additional questions in there to help clarify some of these things. Because again, I can't help it, my background's as a psychologist. So we also ask about some screening questions that get into things like dissociation or relaxation-induced anxiety. Because what we know is that if people are experiencing those things, certain meditations are not going to be a good starting place. And so we're kind of using some of that to help us guide the direction as well. So you might check that out if you're so inclined. And again, it's not designed to be sort of a be-all, end-all, but it's a good starting place. We can see where's somebody at, how can this help us orient toward one of these styles or more. Okay, so I want to spend a few minutes with each of the styles that we've talked about. And so again, focus, we've already kind of described what it is, right? This idea of directing attention toward a specific target. And we've also talked about what it might be good for. So this is just kind of a reminder real quick. But the formula for a focus practice is actually really simple. Now, for those of you who have ever tried to do a focus meditation, you know it's not simple. Yeah, you're like, yeah, I'm going to watch my breath. And that lasts for about, 3 seconds, maybe 5 seconds if you're really good. And then the mind starts to wander off and go do something that's more interesting. Because the reality is watching your breath is pretty darn boring. And the mind just gets tired of it really quick. But this is the idea, right? Can you pick an object, hold your attention there? Then when the mind wanders, which it's going to, that's just part of the game, you got to recognize that the mind wandered, right? You got to catch it. Again, I'm sure some of you have experienced this where you're meditating, you're focusing on your breath, your mind wanders off, and literally minutes go by before you even realize what you've been doing, right? You've been in like a fantasy for the last few minutes, and it's like, oh, I'm supposed to be meditating, right? So part of the game is recognizing that your mind wandered and then getting it back on track. So it's like you're exercising the brain, right? Literally, you're exercising certain functions in the brain related to attention. And what we know from some research, these are just a few bullets, but we know that meditation can improve attention, which makes sense. We know the brain is very plastic. And if you use certain functions in the brain, they get stronger. It's just how it works. And so if you want to get better at paying attention, practice paying attention. And that's literally what this is, right? So, again, you can kind of look at a few of these bullets that just demonstrate some of the outcomes that we've seen with this. Now, I want to just kind of highlight the fourth bullet, because this one was, I think, really interesting. So what it's saying here, so it's saying focused attention, that's what FA stands for. Focused attention meditators improved significantly on a continuous performance task, specifically on omissions. If you're not familiar with a continuous performance test, it's a computerized test that measures attention. It measures attention and impulsivity. It's used as a screening tool for ADHD and things of that nature. And, it's a very simple task. So maybe it's showing you a 1 or a 2 on the screen, or it's saying 1 or 2. And your job is to click the mouse whenever you hear or see a 1 and ignore the 2s, right? So it's a boring, repetitive task, which really requires you to pay attention. That's the whole game. And so when it's talking about omissions, right, it's like you missed it. Something happened, there was a 1 and you didn't even catch it. So what they found was that focused attention meditators improved significantly on this. So they were catching things more accurately. What's interesting, though, is LK stands for loving kindness. The loving kindness meditators did not show any changes on the continuous performance test. So the reason that I'm highlighting this is because this is just one example of where we see that when different styles of meditation are compared head to head, they do have different outcomes. They do different things. They have different impacts. So again, it might be important to identify, well, what is your goal? What are you trying to accomplish? And then choose a meditation style that's going to match that. So, I wanted to talk because of, it's neuromeditation, right? We got to talk about the brain. So I wanted to give an example of what appears to be happening in the brain during a focused meditation practice. And this is sort of an infographic that was made from a study that was conducted years ago, where they grabbed a bunch of people, stuck them in, an fMRI scanner, and had them do a focused meditation practice. And what they would do is periodically interrupt the meditation practice and ask them what was going on, right? So when we interrupted you, what was happening in your meditation? And this is a pretty common way that they examine these things in brain research with meditation, trying to understand the different states of consciousness and what's happening in the brain. And essentially what they found was, if you look at the bottom of the screen, so when they were sustaining their focus, it was activating the frontal lobe, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Makes sense. That's part of what the frontal lobe does. And I like that this infographic has the right frontal lobe highlighted, even though it's going to involve both. The right frontal lobe seems to be a little more important for sustaining attention. So this is actually probably pretty accurate. So you're holding your attention, your frontal lobe is engaged. Then if you go to the next one, there's all kinds of stuff going on here. This is during mind wandering, right? You've lost your attention. So now you're thinking about who knows what. You're thinking about the weekend or, what's on Netflix tonight or whatever you're thinking about. And all kinds of regions of the brain get involved. Mostly this is involved in a network in the brain called the default mode network. And the default mode network, we talk about as being involved in self-referencing. So if you're thinking about something that refers to you, refers to who you are, your sense of identity, how you relate to the world, it's going to engage the default mode network. And there's a lot of regions that are part of that. And you can see a lot of them highlighted here. So that makes perfect sense because if your mind wandered, well, what are you thinking about? Well, you're thinking about yourself one way or another. So you see that light up. So then what happens? Well, you become aware that your mind wandered. So distraction awareness. So now we have a new network that's involved. This is called the salience network. And it's really kind of that aspect of the brain that's helping you decide what's important, what's salient, what are you supposed to be doing with your attention, right? Where's it going? It's kind of a transitional space between kind of this default mode network and that frontal lobe stuff. And then you see there's a reorientation back to focusing on what you're supposed to be focusing on, which again, there's that frontal lobe again, also some attention networks in the parietal lobe, and then we're back here. So I like this image because what it shows is that something as simple, seemingly simple, as a focus meditation is actually exercising multiple really important brain regions. So it makes sense of why something, that looks like nothing actually can have a really significant impact. So we've already kind of alluded to this, but thinking about how this might relate to something like ADHD. Well, again, think about what you're doing during a focus meditation. You're learning to stabilize your attention. You're learning to pay attention to yourself, to recognize what your mind is doing, and how to navigate that. You're learning to disengage from distraction. So something distracts you, it's an internal state, or maybe it's external even, right? There's a noise or something's happening outside of you that pulls your attention away. So can you let go of that and get back? If you think about those things and think about ADHD, like, isn't that exactly what we want folks with ADHD to be able to do? Like literally, it's the same thing. So, to me, it makes perfect sense that this would be an ideal practice. Now, here's the reality. If you take somebody who does have ADHD or other types of attention concerns, and you ask them to do this, that might be a challenge, right? It's like, we're asking them to do what they're not very good at. Now, who wants to do that, right? That's not very fun. In fact, most of us avoid things that we're not good at. It's like, I'm not good at this, so I'm not going to do it. Oh, but that's actually part of the problem, right? Because then the brain gets worse, right? It's like, if you don't exercise those functions, it gets less attentive. And we know this too. We can measure this very easily. And so what we are trying to do in this program is create strategies that are developmentally appropriate for the person and kind of walk them through a series of processes so that they can have success, right? So we're not going to ask somebody that's got attention concerns to sit down and meditate for 30 minutes, watching their breath. Like we're just not even going to go there, right? So it's like somehow we got to find a way to engage them in the process, start working those networks, and then we can always add things down the road, right, to make it a little more challenging. So there's a lot of ways that we can do this. We're not going to be able to get into this all today, right? But, so you can start, we call it layering, where maybe you're watching your breath, but we can add some additional elements to that to make it more engaging. So for example, you can count your breaths. You could stand while you're meditating, right? It's like some of these things are just like being creative because we tend to think of meditation as sitting on a cushion. It's like, well, but why can't you stand? It's like, I don't know. In Qigong practices, that's how you do most of your meditations, is standing. So there are traditions that do that, right? And when you stand, it automatically makes it easier for your brain to be more engaged through a series of other, network processes in the brain. It also makes it harder to fall asleep. If you're one of those people that tend to fall asleep when you meditate, it's hard to do that when you're standing up. You can use something tactile like mala beads. You can use movement practices, right? So something as simple as like a Qigong exercise where you're inhaling, bringing the arms up around the body, exhaling, bringing the arms down, inhaling up, exhaling down, something as simple as that. So now you've got movement. You're still following your breath, but you're using your body. Again, it's way more engaging. You can use technology, which we're a big fan of, using different kinds of biofeedback or neurofeedback to help get direct information about where you're at in the moment. And then there's various other things we can do depending on what the target is, if the target's internal or if it's external or focused on certain areas of the body or using visualization. So there's a lot of ways that we can adapt this basic focus practice for each individual, which is something that we found to be kind of important. Okay. Shifting over to mindfulness. So again, this is just a reminder screen. So non-judgmental awareness of the present moment. We've got the clouds on here, right? Because one way that you often hear people talk about mindfulness is that, if you're watching your thoughts or watching your bodily sensations, almost having the attitude of those thoughts and body sensations and feelings being clouds floating across the sky. So you see them, but they're kind of out there, right? They're not yours. They are yours, but you're shifting your attitude so that it's almost like they're external from you and you're just observing them. You just watch them and you watch them come, you watch them go. So I think the clouds are a nice way to kind of think about that. And we talked about that mindfulness is particularly good for anxiety. So don't worry about this crazy, messy little diagram here, but basically what I'm bringing this up for is to talk about at least one way of thinking about anxiety. So, from an acceptance-based model of anxiety, we can think of anxiety as being, you can see the little bullet there. Anxiety is characterized by a fused, narrow, reactive, and judgmental relationship with internal experiences. So something's happening internally, thoughts, feelings, whatever, and then we kind of get locked into that, right? There's a very narrow, reactive, judgmental way that we're sort of engaging with that, which is then followed by a desire to get rid of it, right? Like, this is uncomfortable. I don't like it. How do I move away from this? And then, of course, what that leads to is a tendency to avoid future situations that may be related to the anxiety. So we start to limit our experiences. We limit what we expose ourselves to. We sort of shrink our world. So what's interesting, if you think about that for a moment and you think about mindfulness, it's kind of the perfect antidote, right? So, on this little diagram, what we have is some of the, I think John Kabat-Zinn, that created mindfulness-based stress reduction. I think he was the first person that kind of articulated these characteristics that seem to be a part of mindfulness practice. And so if you look at those things, literally they're the opposite of what we just described with anxiety and the anxiety process. So I kind of highlighted some of the words that we used on that last slide. fused, narrow, reactive, judgmental, push away, avoid. And then look at these characteristics of mindfulness: non-judgmental, acceptance, trusting, letting go. So literally what you're learning to do is shift into almost the opposite way of engaging. So you still have experiences, whether it's a thought or a feeling or a body sensation, but you're learning to step out of that, not be attached to it, not connect to it, not turn it into a whole nother narrative and another story, right? That just feeds the anxiety and feeds the worry. So again, it makes sense that this would be an ideal practice. And we have evidence for this. So I've mentioned mindfulness-based stress reduction. I think probably everybody's familiar with that practice by now. If you're not, it's an 8-week semi-structured group that is kind of a secular way of teaching mindful practices. And it was created by John Kabat-Zinn. It's been around for, 50 years almost, 40 years. And what's nice about that is that it creates a structure. So it creates a structure to teach it, but it also creates a structure to test it and examine it. Because before you have something like that, how do you see the effects of these meditations, right? Well, you got to go study a monk or something, but that's not really applicable to the vast majority of people. So this makes it really practical. And then there are other programs that have come up too that are very similar, like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. Very similar format, 8-week structured group. You're kind of doing similar things. But it makes sense that cognitive therapy might be nice with this too, because you're also looking at your thoughts. What is your relationship to your thoughts? How are you working with that? How are you engaging with it? So anyway, because these programs are very well known and have been conducted all over the place, there's a lot of research looking at the impact of these programs. And so, if you look at that first bullet, there was a meta-analysis of these two programs that was done a few years ago. And again, just for anybody who's not familiar or doesn't remember, a meta-analysis is basically a research technique where you take a whole bunch of research that was done in one area and kind of combine it. You put it all together and look at, well, what can we tell about this in a larger scale, like, from a 10,000 foot view. So this first meta-analysis found a large effect size for changes in anxiety. So meaning there was, a very significant effect on anxiety. Another bullet, the second bullet, this was a bigger meta-analysis. So same idea, but it was just larger in scope. Included 19 studies, again, found a large effect size for anxiety. So I've got a note at the bottom, just, noting that, well, one thing that's a little bit of a confound is that these courses, including MBSR, it's not purely just mindfulness practice. There's other stuff kind of sprinkled in there, right? So we can't necessarily say it's just from mindfulness, but certainly that seems to be an important element. Now, when we look at the brain, because that's a part of what I do, right? I measure brainwave activity using a 19-channel EEG to see what's going on, how different things affect the brain, how it might be related to mental health concerns, how we can use that information to shift the brain out of those patterns. And when you look at what's going on in the brain during anxiety, it's not like there's just one thing, but there's a lot of evidence and a lot of data showing that one of the most common patterns is an increase of fast brain waves, which kind of makes sense. It's kind of logical. If you've got a lot of fast brain waves cooking around, you're probably going to be anxious, right? It's like too much fast activity. Think about how you feel when you drink too much coffee, right? It's not a perfect analogy, but you get the idea. There's too much fast activity. And, where's this activity happening? Largely right down the middle of the brain. So this is a structure called the cingulate gyrus, which connects your thinking brain, the cortex, to your emotional brain. So the deeper structures in the limbic system. So the cingulate is literally a connector between those things. And this is what lights up, especially the anterior cingulate, right up here in the front. What's interesting is the anterior cingulate will often get overactive when somebody is like obsessive compulsive, right? It's almost like it gets locked, like your attention gets locked. You get fixated and stuck in a certain way of being. So this is what we see commonly with anxiety. And check out what you see with mindfulness. So if you look at what brainwave patterns occur with mindfulness, again, I'm oversimplifying this a bit for today, but one of the patterns that you see is an increase of theta. Theta is a slow brainwave, right? So again, it's like the antidote. If you have too much fast brainwaves, how do you shift that? Well, one way to shift it is to increase slow brainwaves. Theta is a nice slow brainwave. And again, we got lots of bullets here demonstrating that, right? So, and actually I got bullets in here doing two different things. So some of them are showing that mindfulness increases theta. So if you look at like bullet number 2, you look at bullet number, the last bullet, again, the last bullet showing that mindfulness increases theta more than focus. So again, there's a difference. The other bullets are demonstrating that theta is related to less anxiety. So not only does mindfulness increase theta, but it also is associated with reductions in anxiety. So again, perfect counterbalance. Now, one of the things I really appreciate about mindfulness, and I kind of mentioned this at the beginning, is that there's a lot of ways to do mindfulness. So you can do it sort of formally and informally. So by formal practice, it's exactly what it sounds like. You're sitting on your cushion every morning or standing and you're engaged in some sort of mindfulness, practice. Maybe it's a guided meditation or whatever. Maybe you're doing a body scan. Maybe you're doing some sort of mindful movement practice like Qigong or yoga or something like that. So it's a structured way to practice. And formal practices are important, right? It's like building a muscle. So like if you're an athlete, well, you got to practice, right? So every day, if you're a basketball player, you shoot free throws every day. You go to practice and you do the drills, right? That's part of getting good. But then there's the informal practice, which I think is really important for all of these things. But mindfulness lends itself to an informal practice better than some of these other practices. And informal means like, well, how do you bring this into your daily life? It's one thing to do it when you're, doing your practice first thing in the morning. But what about when you're at work or you're at school or you're at the grocery store or you're stuck in traffic or whatever? So this is what I really appreciate about mindfulness. It's like helping people understand and identify ways that they can start doing this throughout the day. And that's where we really see the power come up. It's also how we can start to help people individualize this as well, right? That it's like, okay, there's certain ways that you can do this formally, but then let's start adding in some informal stuff so that it becomes just a natural part of how you exist, during the day. Okay. Jumping over to open heart. So again, intentionally engaging positive emotional states. Usually we're then doing something with those states, right? We're sending that energy to somebody else. Like that's a typical loving kindness practice. So, and in those practices, we may use phrases, right? So we're meditating, we're cultivating this feeling of love and compassion. And then we might imagine somebody sitting in front of us and we imagine sending that energy to them. May you be safe. May you be happy. Whatever it is, we've got these intentions that we're directing toward them. Now, to a large degree, I think there's probably some power in that by itself, not to get too woo-woo, but if you look at some of the research on things like distance healing and things like that, there seems to be actually some pretty good evidence for that, which is kind of interesting. How we use our mind and what we think about seems to have an effect outside of ourselves. So there may be something there, but I think also those phrases at a bare minimum, they help us stay connected to the feeling, right? Which I think is what the core of this is, like activating that feeling and sustaining it, holding that positive emotional state. Now, kind of like the last one with mindfulness, I started off talking about anxiety and then reoriented it back toward mindfulness. So I wanted to do the same thing here with open heart. But now the obvious thing for open heart is depression. And again, I've already kind of given some caveats there, but this is the obvious counterbalance. And what's interesting is when you look at what's going on in the brain with depression, again, there can be multiple things going on. But one of the common things we see is a shift in activity in the frontal lobes, the left versus right. So when somebody is depressed, they tend to have more activity in the right frontal lobe than the left. It's like leaning this way. When somebody is in a more optimistic, positive, engaged kind of a state, there tends to be more activity in the left frontal lobe compared to the right. So you get this sort of like imbalance. And again, you can see some research. Some of these studies are quite old, but I like having them anyway because it just shows how long we've been aware of this. Right? This isn't like new information. We've had this info for a while. Also of interest, one of the first guys that came up with this, Richie Davidson, is actually a big researcher in the meditation space. So he's at the University of Wisconsin. He's the guy that studies the Dalai Lama and works with him. And so, Richie Davidson has been talking about this for a long time, that there's this left versus right shift that's really important. And you can see some of these bullets, right? That this asymmetry in the frontal lobes is highly correlated with scales that measure depression, the Beck Depression Inventory, the MMPI-2 depression scale. We see that this is a pretty stable characteristic. And, in most people, meaning if you measure them today, you measure them tomorrow, you measure them a year from now, it's probably going to still be doing the same thing. I think this last bullet's interesting too. Infants that have this right activation tend to be more reactive to maternal separation. So some of this may just be innate, right? It's like the way we're wired. In fact, we know this, right? We know people that are just like negative all the time, and we know people that are like positive all the time. It may be just partly how they are. Now, for us, the interesting part is, can we shift that? Right? So I just said it's kind of a stable pattern. It's there a lot. Is it possible to shift it? And of course, the answer is yes, or we wouldn't be talking about it. Right? So we can shift that pattern, and there's a lot of ways to do that. You can shift it in a moment, right? It's actually really, it can be changed simply by thinking of something positive, like right now. You'll shift it. But of course, as soon as you stop thinking about that, it's going to tend to go back to its natural resting place. But what we've seen is that certain kinds of meditations, in particular loving kindness or open heart practices, can shift that activation pattern. So this is a very interesting study that, again, we could spend a lot of time talking about this. But just to get to the point, they had people who were previously depressed come in and they were measuring this frontal asymmetry. Half of them were doing a focus meditation. Half of them were doing a loving kindness meditation. And this was just a kind of a one-shot deal, right? So, but they said, well, after a 15-minute meditation, what happens? And what they found was that actually both groups showed positive shifts. Both groups showed shifts toward the left, which is what we want. So that's great. But when you start to break it down a little bit more, they asked people in the group to fill out a brooding scale, right? So how often, it asks questions like this. How often do you think, what am I doing to deserve this? Or why do I always react this way? Whatever. And what we know about brooding is that people that score higher in brooding tend to be depressed. And so they looked at these scores and they said, this is interesting because there's a certain group of these people in this study that scored really high on brooding, and they have a history of depression. Probably they're still depressed. There was another group that scored low in brooding. So they separated those groups and said, does this help us understand the results of our study at all? And what they found was the people that scored high in brooding and were probably still depressed, they actually had a better response to the focus practice than to the loving kindness. So this gets back to our point at the beginning. And the idea behind this of why would that be, it's because somebody who's actively depressed and brooding, asking them to connect to feelings of loving kindness is too far away. Like they actually couldn't do it. So it didn't really have a positive effect. Whereas focusing on your breath, it was shifting their attention to something neutral instead of something negative. That's positive, right? So you're shifting away from the negative. Now, the people that weren't high in brooding, they showed the opposite. They had a really positive response to the loving kindness, shifting it to the left, but not so much to the breathing, which makes sense. Because if they're already at neutral, going to neutral isn't going to have much of an effect. But if you're going from neutral to positive, you really start to see something. So, this has kind of informed us a little bit about how we use this and why I brought it up earlier, that it's like, well, if somebody's really in a bad spot, probably want to start with focus, help them stabilize their attention, shift to something neutral. Once they start getting better, feeling better, then we might shift over to open heart practices. Okay, I realize I'm starting to run short on time. So I want to jump over here to quiet mind real quick. Again, this one's pretty obvious, right? At least in theory, trying to quiet down all that internal chatter. And again, it's good for just about everything. So there's a couple of kind of historical ways of engaging in meditation that seem to connect to this practice pretty closely. One of them is transcendental meditation. And what's interesting about transcendental meditation, I borrowed this chart from somewhere. You actually start with a focused meditation. You start with a mantra. So you're repeating a word or a phrase over and over and over and over and over. So what is that doing? Well, it's stabilizing your attention. It's moving you to neutral. And you're really just focused on one thing. But then what happens over the course of the practice is you start to relax that attention, that narrow attention, until instead of the mantra, your mind just kind of relaxes into this open awareness, this restful place where there's not much going on. So essentially what they're doing is they're shifting your attention to one thing and then eventually take away the one thing. So 1 minus 1, you've got 0. So it's actually a really clever and elegant approach to how to get here. And we see this in other practices that we consider quiet mind as well. They've got clever strategies. And I think this is important because, again, for most people, if they just sit down and try to quiet their mind, that is not going to work. So we have to kind of give them some skills and some practices that are going to help them get there. We'll talk more about that in a second. If you look at what's going on in the brain during quiet mind, there's a significant increase of a certain brainwave. It's right at the bottom of alpha. Alpha is this kind of relaxed internal brainwave. So that makes sense. It's relaxed internal awareness, but it's at the very bottom of the alpha range. It's almost in theta. So it's this very quiet, very internalized state. And the region of the brain that this happens in most is the default mode network, which we already talked about, right? So the default mode network comes up a lot in meditation. Because if you remember, this has to do with thinking about ourselves. So this could be imagining something in your mind about yourself. It could be a memory. It could be reflecting on yourself, social comparison, judging. There's all sorts of ways that this gets activated. So doesn't it make sense that this part of the brain is going to get really quiet, when you're actually doing this practice the way it's designed? Makes perfect sense. Now, I mentioned this before that, quiet mind might be good for just about everything. And in fact, it seems to be. There's a whole mountain of research, especially looking at transcendental meditation and Zen. And Zen kind of falls into this category. Seems to be good for just about everything. The trick, of course, is that, of course, you could just say, like, well, why don't we just do this? Well, two reasons. One, depending on your goals, there may be something else that could be a little more efficient at getting you there. The other thing is, because quiet mind is so challenging for people, that may not be the way to go or the way to start. And then the third thing, I kind of mentioned this with the quiz. If somebody deals with things like dissociation or with relaxation-induced anxiety, this is not where we're going to take them, because we could just be asking actually for trouble. So in some cases, people will start to meditate and they start feeling worse, or they get really anxious, or actually old stuff comes up, old trauma that they haven't worked through. So, we want to have sort of a trauma-informed approach to how we're using meditation, especially with clients. Okay. Very quickly, I was mentioning other strategies for getting into this quiet mind state. One of them was created by this guy, Les Femi. He's an old neurofeedback guy, and he wrote this book called The Open Focus Brain. And what he would do is he would use guided meditations that would take people into these places where he's directing their attention toward space. It's like negative space in art. So he would ask people to pay attention to things like distance and volume, right? So there's nothing there. So, can you imagine the distance between your eyes? Is it possible for you to imagine the space between your right thumb and your right index finger? So what's interesting is when you start to put your attention in those spaces, the mind gets quiet because there's nothing there. So it's super clever. He's giving you something to pay attention to, but what you're paying attention to is nothing. Right? So the point of bringing this up is that there are strategies to help people learn how to get to these places without just sitting wrestling with your thoughts. Now, the last thing I wanted to bring up is that we do use other tools at times too. So one of them that we use a lot is using EEG devices so that we can monitor your brainwave activity, or you can monitor your brainwave activity while you're meditating. So you can actually see some of these patterns that we were talking about and then get immediate feedback on whether you're in the desired state or not. So my favorite device at the moment, I've actually pulled it out of my backpack. It's actually a baseball cap. And so there's one sensor kind of right here. Here's what it looks like. So it's a dry Bluetooth sensor. You don't have to put goop on it. And you can move it anywhere on the cap. So this makes it really easy to use it for a variety of meditation practices. If we want to measure the default mode network, we stick it back here, the electrode. If we want to do something with focus, we might put it up here in the front. If we're doing an open heart, we may want to stick it on the side where we measure more emotional content. So, and it connects to your phone. So you run it off of your phone, right? So this is the Divergence platform that we've been using. Like it a lot. It's a very effective tool. Essentially what happens is that there's some sort of music attached to your brain waves, like meditation music. And so if you're in the desired meditation state, then that music, the volume gets a little bit louder. So that's your cue, right? That it's like, oh, I'm in the right spot. Okay, just stay there. And then as soon as your mind wanders off task, the volume starts to drop. Right? The volume doesn't go all the way away because that's annoying, right? If it was going like we don't want that. But the volume drops, which catches your attention. And it's like, oh, oops, okay, what happened? You reshift your attention. Here comes the volume again. So it's kind of like a power tool for meditation. So we have different ways that we kind of teach. We teach kind of like, more of a traditional way of teaching that offers a lot of options. And then we start using tech. So if anybody's interested, we do have a couple of things coming up. We have a level 1 class that's coming up on Zoom. It's 4 Fridays, starting September 5th. You can find all this on our website, of course. And then we have a EEG guided meditation course for people that think they might want to use this for themselves or with their clients or students, teaching them how to use the platform and how to use the various meditations. And that one starts at the beginning of October. So again, all of this is on the NeuroMeditation website, neuromeditationinstitute.com. I know we're almost up at time. I'm fine with staying a little bit longer, but I realize probably some of you have to jump onto something else. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see you guys. And then I'm happy to chat with any questions. I know it was a lot. I'm just like, I told you at the beginning, right? It's like an hour is tricky. Somehow I got through it. So let me stop sharing.
Jeff, the one question we've got in the chat is, will the PowerPoint slides be shared?
Sure. I'll make a PDF of the slide deck and send that to you guys if you want. If that's okay, we've got your email. Is that okay if we send it to you guys? Okay. Yeah, no problem. Any other questions? Will the recording be shared? I saw that just pop up. Yeah, what I'll do is, because we recorded this, I'll stick it up on our YouTube channel. So how about this? Once I put it up on the YouTube channel, we'll send you guys a follow-up email. And I'll put the link to the YouTube recording and I'll put the PowerPoint, the PDF in there. And maybe we'll put the links to the classes in there too, just in case you're interested in that. Any other questions? No, you guys are easy. Okay, if you have any questions or anything comes up, please shoot us an email. You can send it to info@neuromeditationinstitute.com. It's kind of a long one, but that's where you can find us. And appreciate you guys being here, and hope to see you in the future. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much. That was lovely. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Appreciate it.